In the glittering courts of Europe's most powerful empires, where diamonds sparkled on velvet and monarchs whispered secrets beneath golden chandeliers, an invisible menace moved in silence. It slipped through bedsheets instead of battlefields, wielded no sword, yet slayed kings, queens, and entire dynasties. This wasn't a foreign invasion or civil rebellion. It was something far more intimate and far more insidious. A kiss, a touch, a single night of forbidden pleasure. That was all it took. What followed was not just personal ruin, but political catastrophe. Marriages crumbled, heirs were lost, bloodlines fell into chaos. Monarchs, cloaked in opulence and surrounded by physicians, found themselves helpless, brought to their knees by a disease that knew no rank and respected no crown. It left disfigurement, madness, infertility, and death in its path. But worst of all, it left questions. What might history have looked like if certain rulers had lived longer? If certain queens had borne sons? If certain heirs had never been born at all? This is the untold story of how syphilis, the so-called great imitator, did more than devastate the body. It reshaped the course of history from behind the palace walls. These are the secret plagues of royalty, and this is the disease that ruled the rulers. Lorenzo de' Medici was born into one of the most powerful dynasties of the Renaissance, a family that had produced popes, rulers, and patrons of genius. With Pope Leo X as his uncle, Lorenzo was handed an army and sent to claim the Duchy of Urbino, which he did with ruthless precision. But the victories of war often come with invisible enemies. Soldiers of the day, including Lorenzo, lived fast and often sought comfort in the arms of sex workers. Just decades after syphilis first erupted across Europe, the disease had become a deadly spectre in the shadows of glory. Soon after securing his title, Lorenzo married the noble Frenchwoman Madeleine de la Tour. Their union was short but fruitful, producing a daughter, Catherine, who would one day become Queen of France. But their joy was cruelly brief. Madeleine died just 2 weeks after giving birth. Lorenzo followed days later, sick and broken at just 26 years old. Their daughter, left orphaned and locked away in a convent during political turmoil, would rise from tragedy to become one of Europe's most formidable monarchs, Catherine de' Medici. The infection that claimed her parents had unknowingly reshaped the future of France. He became Shah at just 9 years old, and by 15, Abbas II was fully in command, ushering in one of Persia's most celebrated periods. His reign shimmered with prosperity, trade routes thrived, poets flourished, and the royal court basked in a haze of luxury, wine, and endless feasts. Abbas was known for his charm, wit, and tolerance. He drank from golden goblets encrusted with rubies, gifts from the Russian Tsar, and his victories against the Mughals and Russians solidified his place as a formidable ruler. Yet beneath the glitter of his court, a shadow crept in, one that no crown could keep at bay: syphilis. As the disease slowly took hold, the once vibrant Shah began to withdraw. His legendary parties grew fewer, his brilliance faded. By the time he was 34, Abbas had disappeared from public life, isolated, in pain, and overtaken by illness. His death marked more than the loss of a king. It marked the fading of Persia's golden age. The decline of an empire had begun, not with swords or rebellion, but with the slow unraveling of its ruler from within. In the decadent glow of Charles II's Restoration Court, no one burned brighter or fell harder than John Wilmot. A celebrated war hero, a razor-sharp poet, and a notorious libertine, Rochester lived for pleasure. He was the king's favourite, a darling of the theatre, and a legend in every tavern and salon from Whitehall to Covent Garden. But behind his clever satire and magnetic charm, something darker was at work. Syphilis, rampant in Restoration London, was already poisoning his body and mind. For years, he masked the symptoms with wit and wine, but the disease was relentless. By his early 30s, Rochester's brilliance had faded. The handsome rake was now disfigured, his nose ravaged, his eyesight lost, his body frail and failing. Once the life of the court, he spent his final days in isolation, racked with pain and shame. His death at just 33 was more than a personal tragedy. It was a grim symbol of the era's hedonism turned hollow. Rochester had lived for excess, and in the end, it consumed him completely. Joseph I was everything a young emperor should be: tall, charming, and full of promise. With his sharp intellect and progressive spirit, he brought a sense of modernity to the aging halls of the Habsburg court. But behind the regal image was a man driven not only by power but by pleasure. From noble ladies to peasant girls, Joseph's conquests became the talk of Europe. His appetite for affairs was legendary, but so were the consequences. At some point during his youthful indulgence, he contracted syphilis, an affliction he unknowingly passed on to his wife, Empress Wilhelmina Amalia. The result was devastating. The empress, once full of hope to bear heirs, became infertile. The dream of a secure male succession was shattered, and with it, the stability of the Habsburg line. When Joseph died suddenly at just 32, not from syphilis, but from smallpox, the empire faced a crisis. His younger brother, Charles VI, inherited the throne. But the lack of a male heir set off a political chain reaction that would erupt into the War of the Austrian Succession, a conflict rooted not in armies or ideology, but in the private, hidden devastation of disease. He was never meant to wear the crown. Louis I, second son of Queen Maria II, preferred poetry over politics, Shakespeare over statecraft. A quiet soul with a scholarly mind, he spent his early years translating English literature and courting muses rather than ministers, but fate had other plans. When illness swept through the royal family, claiming his elder brother and younger siblings, Louis was suddenly thrust into power. The poet prince became king, reluctantly, yet dutifully. In public, he was the image of cultured dignity, but in private, the story was different. Whispers followed him through Lisbon's corridors, of secret affairs, actresses, and liaisons with women far outside the bounds of royal protocol. Somewhere along this hidden path, Louis contracted syphilis. For years, it slept within him, but as time passed, the symptoms returned with brutal force. Neurological damage crept in, depression darkened his once gentle nature, pain consumed him. Those closest to the king watched him fade, not just physically, but mentally, as the disease slowly unraveled his mind. By the time he died at the age of 50, the poet king who once charmed Europe with his intellect and refinement was barely recognizable. His reign, rich in culture and language, ended under the shadow of suffering, his brilliance dimmed by a plague he carried in silence. He was the great Habsburg hope, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and the iconic Empress Elizabeth, known to the world as Sisi. But behind the grandeur of the Austro-Hungarian court, Rudolf grew up in isolation, burdened by expectation and haunted by a deep sense of melancholy. From a young age, he rebelled against the rigid traditions of his father's empire. Sensitive, intelligent, and progressive in thought, Rudolf found no outlet in courtly life. Instead, he turned to darker comforts: alcohol, fleeting affairs, and reckless pursuits. It wasn't long before his indulgences caught up with him. Rudolf was diagnosed with both syphilis and gonorrhea, diseases that ravaged his body and mind. In a cruel twist, he passed the infection to his wife, Princess Stephanie of Belgium, rendering her unable to bear more children. The Habsburgs' hope for a future heir died not in war, but in a bedroom. As his health declined, so did his mental stability. Paranoia, violent mood swings, and romantic delusions plagued him. Obsessed with death and driven by despair, Rudolf withdrew from public life, his condition known but never spoken of openly. Then came mireling. In 1889, Rudolf secluded himself at his hunting lodge with his 17-year-old mistress, Baroness Mary Vetsera. There, in an atmosphere thick with desperation, he shot her before turning the gun on himself. The royal court scrambled to cover it up, claiming an aneurysm, fabricating letters, and burying the truth along with their prince. But the damage was done. The mireling tragedy sent shockwaves through Europe. It wasn't just the loss of a crown prince, it was the unraveling of a dynasty. Rudolf's death left a hole in the Habsburg succession that would haunt the empire until its collapse in World War I. A dynasty built on tradition and image had been undone by illness, secrecy, and sorrow. In a family known for its rigid decorum and imperial pride, Archduke Otto Franz stood out for all the wrong reasons. Nicknamed the Black Sheep of the Habsburg dynasty, Otto scandalized the royal court with behavior that was anything but princely. He was infamous for his outrageous escapades, crashing formal dinners in the nude, storming into women's quarters wearing nothing but a sword, and flaunting his liaisons with courtesans and actresses. To some, he was a joke. to others a threat to the dignity of the monarchy. But behind the provocateur was a man slowly being consumed from within. In his mid-30s, Otto contracted syphilis, the same disease that had already cast its long shadow across Europe's royal houses. At first, he tried to ignore it, masking the symptoms with travel, drink, and distractions. But syphilis, in its later stages, offers no mercy. His condition deteriorated rapidly. Painful lesions and neurological symptoms took hold. The most shocking sign came when the disease devoured part of his face, forcing him to wear a rubber prosthetic nose just to appear in public. For a man who once thrived on attention, it was the ultimate humiliation. Shamed, sick, and no longer welcome at court, Otto retreated from public life. By the age of 41, he was dead, his legacy reduced to scandal, shame, and sorrow. Had he survived longer, he might have stood in line for the throne. But fate and disease had other plans. The Habsburg monarchy would continue, but its foundations were already rotting. Just over a decade after Otto's death, the empire itself would collapse, its fall accelerated by the personal tragedies of men like him. They wore golden crowns, commanded empires, and ruled over millions. But beneath the silks and scepters they carried a secret torment. Syphilis, a disease as silent as it was savage, spared no throne. It crept through royal chambers unnoticed, changing not just lives, but the course of nations. This wasn't just a medical crisis, it was a hidden force that rewrote dynastic lines, ended bloodlines, and shaped European history in ways no sword ever could. From the candlelit palaces of Florence to the glittering courts of Vienna, syphilis moved like a phantom, its victims too powerful to admit they were vulnerable and too human to escape what followed. And yet, for centuries, there was no cure, only pain, only shame, only decline. That is, until a forgotten petri dish changed everything. In 1928, Scottish scientist Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, a chance accident that would revolutionize medicine. At last, the silent killer that had haunted kings and queens for generations could be stopped. But for those royals who came before, the cure arrived far too late. Syphilis didn't just ruin bodies, it reshaped empires. And in doing so, it became one of the most influential and invisible forces in royal history.